This is Vint Cerf. I'm Vice President and Chief Internet Evangelist at Google, and it's been my pleasure to take a rather quick tour through the new exhibit. One of the interesting things about museums is that they typically are a place, and to learn what's there, you typically have to go there. And I'm a big fan, a big believer that the content of a museum, especially one like the exhibit that we're talking about, which has been very carefully thought through, ought to be accessible in a number of different ways. It's actually important to be able to go in and experience the exhibit space and the real artifacts that are shown. But it's also valuable to be able to discover this online. I can remember having a very interesting experience with the former First Lady, Hillary Clinton, now Senator Clinton, when she was at the White House. I was working for MCI, and she wanted to move American artifacts from the White House to the American Museum, the National Museum of American Art. And the reason she wanted to do that is she thought more people would see these things in the museum than they would walking through the White House. At the same time, MCI offered to put up websites that would catalog all the artifacts and then have interviews with the sculptors and have weekly examination of where they were on a particular project. So you kind of follow the project. So an announcement was made, and there's sort of opening day with all the things in the National Museum of American Art, all the new artifacts, and Mrs. Clinton made her presentation. And then we talked a little bit about the online experience, and some reporter jumped up and irately said he thought it was terrible that we were putting this stuff online, and it wasn't the same as the museum experience, and it was just all, very artificial, and it was two-dimensional, and so ranted for a while. And so I was gearing myself up to have a response to that, and I didn't have to. The artists were in the room too, and one artist jumped up and it said, you idiot. Don't you know that anything that gets people interested in art is important and useful and valuable? And any medium that we can get people to experience art with is a good thing. So sit down, go away. That was a very powerful message from my point of view, and I'm now very much a proponent of helping people discover art and history, and it's a deeper insight into it by any means possible. So I'm really glad if Google can assist the Victoria and the Albert to bring this information to a community which is 1.5 billion and growing, as opposed to whatever number managed to get to the various exhibits that you have of this same material. You asked about the Sputnik and what impact that had. First of all, it's visually dramatic as you come into the exhibit. And for me personally, Sputnik had a huge amount to do with the career I ultimately experienced, because when it was launched, it shocked the Americans into realizing that the Russians were potentially ahead of them in space. And it generated a massive interest in science, engineering, mathematics, and technology in schools, which I benefited from. So ultimately, I ended up working for companies like Rocketdyne, building the F1 engines for the Apollo program. So this had a very dramatic effect. It's so iconic. It's a beautiful thing to begin with, and the way it's presented is lovely, but for me it is such a punctuation point in my own personal history that day really resonates in my head. What I like, though, is all of the physical artifacts, the architectural things, seeing things from the Eastern Bloc that I didn't know anything about. Which I think is valuable. It tells us that things were going on that the West didn't know about. It illustrates a creativity and exploration of ideas that many of us just never, knew anything about, or even didn't imagine that anybody considered doing there. It was always these stultifying old, buildings that looked like they were built in, 300 years ago. So that was refreshing. This was enormously exciting, and I participated in various ways as a young man in this effort. The F1 engines for the Apollo program were being developed at Rocketdyne, and I got to do testing for those in the Santa Susana Mountains in California. And later, the Lunar Excursion Module attitude control rockets were part of the portfolio. When we landed on the moon, all of us who read science fiction thought the beginning of the science fiction world had started, that in 20 years' time we would all be going to the moon and to the rest of the planets. And of course, it didn't quite work out that way. Here we are in the year 2008, and we're still hoping to get back to the moon and off to Mars.
But we should.
But, well, we will get there eventually, and in the meantime, we are sending robotic equipment there. And for me personally, this is a big deal, because I've been working for the last 10 years on an interplanetary expansion of the Internet in order to support space, manned and robotic exploration, and to give a richer communications environment for it. So for me, all of this, including the wonderful end of the exhibit with the fragile planet Earth seen from the moon, is a part of the hope of humanity that we will in fact continue to expand in our solar system. Certainly during the 1950s, all of us were very worried about atomic obliteration and the like, and yet in that same period of time, computers which have been developed for military purposes were also being adapted to civilian applications. And in a very interesting way, in this exhibit, one does not see the invisible revolution. One sees the palpable one, architecture, costumes and outfits and artifacts. There was an invisible revolution in the information world, triggered again by Sputnik and the developments post-World War II. So that would be the subject of perhaps another exhibit, to make visible this invisible revolution. It was all oriented around military response to the concern that the Russians were building up a capability that they could use to come across the Fulda Gap in Europe. NATO got created as a political entity, a military political entity. I think that the general impetus here was to do everything possible to constrain the Russians. Remember that the policy throughout the Cold War was mutually assured destruction. That is to say that no matter how many missiles either side had, you never wanted to launch them. Of course, everybody remembers the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, which put us just on the hairy edge of launching. And we backed away from that. And I think that, so in that case, the theory more or less held. Nobody wanted to push that button. After Sputnik was launched, President Eisenhower said, this will not happen again. We will get into space now. And so the Advanced Research Projects Agency was created. And its first job was to get the U.S. into space, and its next job was to essentially divest that activity to the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. And the reason for that was to try to make sure that space activity would be a civilian activity and not a military one. And that was an important decision. For a long period of time during this Cold War, there was always a concern that the Russian technology was very, very focused on military capability. And so an awful lot of what we did during that period was focused on making sure that we would not be technologically surprised by what the Russians were doing. And so a great deal of the research that I was involved in was intended to avoid another surprise like Sputnik. And of course it was wonderful because that meant that we could imagine all kinds of awful things that they might be able to do and say, well, we better go explore this and this and this and this just in case, which gave us an enormous latitude for trying out new technologies. And that's of course where the Internet came from. Certainly the Internet's origins came from the study of how to build reliable command and control systems that could survive a nuclear attack. A man at Rand Corporation, Paul Barron, thought the unthinkable. How do I recover from an atomic attack and put the command and control system back together? It essentially invented the idea of packet switching along with two other people, one here in the UK, Donald Davies at the National Physical Laboratory and Leonard Kleinrock at MIT. So the origins of this notion of packet switching eventually evolved into a Defense Department experiment, which started out as the ARPANET and became the Internet. And so all of that, of course, is now exploded into public consciousness. And the manifestation has been a huge contribution of knowledge from everyone in the world, 1.5 billion people on the Internet sharing their information. So anyone who says to you, information is power, is wrong. It's information sharing that's power.